The Doctrine of Mentalism. The Urantia Book versus A Course in Miracles. The Urantia Book and A Course in Miracles both touch on spiritual and metaphysical themes, but they come from very different perspectives. In A Course in Miracles, ACIM, the doctrine of mentalism is central. ACIM asserts that reality is fundamentally a projection of the mind, and that the world we perceive is an illusion created by the ego. According to ACIM, the mind creates experience. Everything we perceive is the result of thoughts. The Course famously states, "The world you see is nothing more than the outward picture of an inward condition." The world is an illusion. The physical universe is not real in an absolute sense, but is a miscreation of the split mind. It is a dream of separation from God, where individuals believe in bodies and duality, reinforcing the illusion. Only love is real. ACIM teaches that only God's eternal reality, pure love, exists. Everything else, including time and space, is a fabrication of the ego. Forgiveness as a path to true perception. To awaken from illusion, one must practice forgiveness, which undoes the false projections of the mind and reveals reality as God created it. Essentially, in ACIM, the role of the mind is absolute. It creates perception entirely, and the world is a product of erroneous thought rather than an external, objective reality. Awakening means recognizing this and returning to a state of divine oneness beyond the illusion of separateness. In the Urantia Book, the nature of reality and the role of the mind in creating experience are framed quite differently than in A Course in Miracles. While the Urantia Book acknowledges the primacy of mind and spirit, it does not support a strict mentalist view where reality is purely a projection of thought. Instead, it presents a structured, hierarchical universe created by God, where reality is objective and created by God. Unlike ACIM's idea that the world is an illusion of the mind, the Urantia Book teaches that the cosmos is real, purposeful, and divinely orchestrated. The material, mindal, and spiritual realms are distinct but interconnected aspects of a vast divine plan. Mind is a medium, not the creator. Human experience is shaped by mind, but mind does not generate reality. Instead, mind operates within an objective framework established by God. The thought adjuster, the divine fragment of God within each person, influences perception, but does not create external reality. Spiritual growth is progressive, not instantaneous. Rather than awakening from illusion, as in ACIM, the Urantia Book describes a long evolutionary path toward divine understanding and ultimate unity with God. The goal is ascension through wisdom and experience, rather than recognizing the unreality of the world. Truth is revealed, not just realized. While ACIM suggests that enlightenment comes through inner realization, undoing illusion through forgiveness. The Urantia Book describes a divine plan where truth is progressively revealed to beings at different stages of spiritual development. In short, the Urantia Book sees mind as a tool for interpreting reality, rather than the generator of experience itself. Reality is not an illusion but a structured creation in which individuals play a role in their own spiritual evolution. A Course in Miracles, ACIM, is deeply influenced by Eastern metaphysical thought, particularly Advaita Vedanta, non-dualism, and certain aspects of Buddhist philosophy. While it presents itself in Christian terminology, its core ideas align more with Eastern monism than traditional Western theism. If ACIM were to introduce its Eastern influences, it might say something like this. ACIM. At the heart of my teaching is the recognition that all separation is illusion. The world, as you see it, is not real in the absolute sense. It is a projection of the split mind, a dream that arises from belief in separation from God. This is not a new idea. The ancient sages of the East knew this truth. The Advaita Vedantists of India taught that the phenomenal world is Maya, illusion, and that only the eternal, formless reality, Brahman, exists. The Buddha spoke of the impermanence of all conditioned things, urging seekers to awaken from the cycle of suffering. Likewise, I teach that your experience of the world is the result of mistaken perception. The ego, your false sense of self, constructs a world of duality, conflict, and suffering, but this is not reality. You are, in truth, one with God beyond time and space. Salvation lies not in changing the world, but in recognizing that it was never real to begin with. To awaken is to remember that the separation never happened at all. This framework is much closer to Eastern idealism than to Western theistic traditions, where God creates an independent, objectively real universe. ACIM is also reminiscent of Mahayana Buddhist thought, especially Yogacara, which emphasizes that perception is a projection of the mind. The Urantia Book would push back strongly against ACIM's radical idealism, arguing that reality is not an illusion but a structured, divinely created cosmos. It would emphasize that while mind plays a role in perception, it does not generate the external world. Here's how the Urantia Book might respond. Urantia, your view, while poetic, denies the reality of divine creation. The universe is not a dream to be dissolved but a living system designed by God for the growth of beings like yourself. You claim that the world is illusion and that all separation is a false perception of the mind. But consider this: if all things are simply mind's projection, where is the divine purpose? Where is the journey of the soul? God, the Universal Father, is the source of all reality. Matter, mind, and spirit each have their rightful place in His grand design. The material universe is not an error, it is a framework for soul evolution. True, the mind can be deceived, and human perception is incomplete, but this does not make the world unreal. It simply means that you must grow into higher understanding through experience. Moreover, personality is not an illusion. The Father has gifted each being with individuality, will, and the potential for eternal progression. Your spiritual growth does not come through negating the world but by engaging with it, learning, serving, and seeking ever deeper truth. The goal is not to awaken from an illusion, but to ascend towards divine perfection. This response highlights the teleological nature of the Urantia Book's cosmology. Reality has a purpose, and the human journey is one of progressive spiritual enlightenment, not the dissolution of the world into formless unity. This seems like a clear Western theism versus Eastern non-dualism divide. ACIM would defend its claim that the material world is a mistake and not created by God by emphasizing its radical distinction between reality, God's perfect oneness, and illusion, everything perceived by the ego. Its argument might go something like this. ACIM. You assume that God created the world you see, but this is impossible. God is perfect, eternal, and unchanging. Would a perfect creator bring forth a world of death, suffering, and conflict? Would divine love create a realm of pain and fear? No, such a creation would contradict the very nature of God. What you call reality is, in truth, a projection of the mind that believed it could separate from its source. This is why I say that the world is a mistake. Not in the sense that you personally made it, but that the split mind, the part that believed in separation, miscreated it. This world is the effect of a single false thought, the belief that separation from God could actually occur. But separation never truly happened. The ego's projection makes it seem real, just as a dream appears real to the dreamer. You insist that the world is a place for soul evolution. But why would God, who is pure love, create a place of suffering to teach His children? The idea that you must struggle, suffer, and earn your way back to God is an illusion of the ego. You are already home. The only thing required is to remember the truth. This world is not your home, and it was never God's creation. Forgiveness is the key to waking up from the dream. As you withdraw belief from the illusions of the world, the false self dissolves, and only God's eternal reality remains. This is salvation, not through learning, not through struggle, but through the simple recognition that the separation never happened. This argument relies on the premise that a perfect God could not create an imperfect world, so the world must be a false projection. It also denies the progressive ascension idea in the Urantia Book, arguing instead for an instant recognition of truth. The Urantia Book would counter ACIM's view by arguing that the material world is not a mistake but a necessary and meaningful part of the divine plan. It would likely respond along these lines. Urantia, you claim that the world is an illusion and that suffering proves God did not create it. But this reasoning misunderstands the nature of divine purpose. God did create reality, material, mindal, and spiritual, and He created it with the purpose of soul growth. The evolutionary worlds are not errors but stepping stones toward perfection. True, this world is not your final destination, but it is a vital beginning. The struggles of mortal life refine the soul, forging wisdom, character, and love. You ask, would a God of love create a world where suffering exists? But I ask you, would a God of love create beings who could never learn and grow into divine perfection? Your doctrine would rob mortals of their evolutionary path. The journey of faith and effort that makes them into phenoliters, eternal beings perfected through experience. Moreover, your view is not new. It is a form of Gnosticism, an ancient belief that rejected the material world as the work of a lesser, mistaken power. The Gnostics, like you, believed that true salvation was about escaping the world, not engaging with it. They saw creation as a prison, rather than a divine gift. But this is an error. The material world is not a trap, it is the starting point of the great adventure toward God. God's plan is not about waking up from illusion, it is about growing into truth. Reality is not something to be negated but to be embraced, understood, and ascended through. You are not meant to dissolve into formlessness but to become a unique, perfected personality in union with the Universal Father. This response directly challenges ACIM's core assumption that the world is a mistake by arguing that struggle and imperfection are part of a divine educational process. It also links ACIM to Gnosticism, which the Urantia Book implicitly rejects by affirming the goodness of material creation and the necessity of evolutionary progress. ACIM would likely approach scientific discoveries, such as atomic structure, by arguing that they are part of the illusion of form, detailed but ultimately meaningless within the framework of true reality. Here's how it might respond. ACIM. Science is merely the study of a dream. You analyze atoms, molecules, forces, and laws, but all of these are constructs within a projected illusion. Just as a dream at night may have its own internal logic, rules, and apparent structure, so too does the world you perceive. But this does not make it real in the absolute sense. You may say, but we can measure and manipulate these things. We build technologies, harness energy, and send probes into space. Yet all of this occurs within the framework of the ego's illusion. Reality is not defined by the complexity or predictability of illusion. You could study the physics of a dream world, but upon awakening, you would realize none of it truly existed. Science may provide understanding within the dream, but it does not reveal truth. True knowledge comes not through examining matter but through transcending it. The mind that believes in separation generates an entire cosmos of forms to reinforce its illusion of independence. But God's creation has nothing to do with particles, energy, or space-time. It is eternal, changeless, and beyond all perception. You ask, how can something so intricate not be real? But the question itself arises from false premises. Complexity does not equate to truth. Just as an elaborate fantasy remains fiction no matter how detailed, the physical universe remains an illusion no matter how deeply it is studied. ACIM would likely insist that scientific discoveries, while internally consistent, are still part of the false world projected by the ego. The more one invests in studying the illusion, the more one becomes entangled in it rather than awakening from it. The Urantia Book would likely reject ACIM's claim that the world and human life are meaningless, arguing instead that science reveals divine order and that mortal experience is a crucial part of soul evolution. Here's how it might respond. Urantia, you dismiss science as the study of illusion, but this denies the very structure and intention of divine creation. Science is the unfolding discovery of the laws and patterns that govern the physical universe, laws established by God as the foundation for mortal experience. The very fact that your world exhibits order, complexity, and discoverable principles is evidence of divine intelligence. To say that atomic structure and natural laws are illusions is to misunderstand the purpose of material existence. The universe is real, but it is incomplete. It is an evolving system designed to foster the growth of souls. Science is not a distraction but a means by which the human mind can perceive and appreciate the grandeur of God's handiwork. While physical discoveries alone cannot bring spiritual enlightenment, they are steps in the journey toward truth. Even Jesus, when he walked on Urantia, did not teach that the world was meaningless. Rather, he taught that it was a place of spiritual preparation. You say that life should not be given much attention because it is unreal. But if that were true, why does God place ascending personalities into the material worlds to begin with? Why does he provide a thought adjuster, a fragment of himself, to guide each soul through the struggles of time and space? The answer is simple, because life here does matter. Experience in the material world is how souls begin their eternal ascent. You are not here to escape reality. You are here to engage with it, to grow in wisdom and love, and to prepare for greater service in the ages to come. Your doctrine is not one of enlightenment, but of negation. You would have mortals dismiss their experiences as meaningless rather than embrace them as the stepping stones of eternity. Reality is not something to be discarded, it is to be discovered, expanded, and perfected. The highest truth is not that the world is an illusion, but that it is the beginning of an eternal adventure. This response defends the idea that science is not a distraction but a means of understanding divine order. It also directly counters ACIM's claim that life is meaningless, arguing that material experience has deep purpose as part of the soul's journey toward God. ACIM would likely try to incorporate modern physics, especially quantum mechanics and relativity, into its framework to reinforce its view of the illusory nature of matter. Quantum theory, with its strange, non-intuitive principles like wave-particle duality and the observer effect, is often used by proponents of spiritual idealism to suggest that reality is not fixed and is instead shaped by consciousness or perception. ACIM could argue something like this. ACIM. You may argue that science shows the order and complexity of the material world, but I would ask you to consider the implications of quantum mechanics. Physics has demonstrated that the material world is not as solid and objective as it appears. The behavior of particles at the quantum level depends on observation, suggesting that reality is not independent of the mind. What you see as matter is simply energy in different states of vibration, and even that can be altered by the act of perception. The observer effect, where the outcome of a quantum experiment changes depending on whether it is observed, points to the fact that the universe is not fixed or real in the way you think. It shows that reality is influenced by consciousness. This is precisely what I teach. The world is not external, it is a projection of your thoughts. The material world, like a quantum field, is fluid and responsive to the mind. The distinctions between objects and subjects are artificial, they are part of the illusion. The fact that the universe behaves according to the laws of quantum mechanics does not invalidate my teachings, it affirms them. The world you perceive is not the world as it truly is, but a mental construct. Just as light behaves differently when it is measured, the world shifts according to the beliefs and thoughts of the mind. What you perceive as the objective world is simply an illusion of form. In this argument, ACIM would align with the idea that quantum mechanics supports the notion that reality is not as objective as it seems, implying that consciousness plays a central role in shaping experience. They would assert that this supports their teaching that the material world is an illusion created by the mind, much like how quantum phenomena seem to be influenced by observation or measurement. The Urantia Book, however, would likely reject this interpretation, emphasizing that while science does reveal surprising and complex aspects of the universe, it does not change the fact that the universe itself is real and divinely created. It might point out that quantum mechanics, while puzzling, still operates within a larger objective system that reflects divine order. The Urantia Book would likely acknowledge that our senses do not capture reality in its entirety, recognizing the limitations of human perception, but it would firmly assert that there is a real, objective universe that exists independent of individual consciousness. Here's how the Urantia Book might approach this. Urantia. It is true that your perception of the material world is incomplete and limited. Mortal minds are confined by the limitations of their sensory apparatus and the evolutionary state of their consciousness. The world you perceive is but a fragment of the larger reality. However, this does not mean that the material world is purely subjective or illusory. While your senses may distort the full truth, they are still interacting with an objective reality, a reality that exists independent of your thoughts or perceptions. What you call the material universe is not a mere figment of the mind, but a vast, divinely ordered cosmos. It operates according to universal laws that are consistent and can be discovered through science. The fact that your perception of reality is incomplete is not an indication that the material world is illusory. Rather, it reflects the limited capacity of the mind to comprehend the vastness of creation. As your consciousness expands through intellectual, spiritual, and moral growth, you will gain a deeper understanding of the objective world and the purpose it serves. The universe is not an illusion, it is the living, dynamic creation of a loving God. The physical world is the starting point for your spiritual journey. It provides the arena in which your personality develops, your will is tested, and your soul ascends toward perfection. The objective reality of the universe is not negated by the limitations of your perception, it is revealed through the progress of your mind and spirit. In this way, the Urantia Book would acknowledge that our subjective perceptions are imperfect but would firmly stand by the existence of a material world that operates independently of the individual mind. The world is not an illusion to be escaped, but a reality to be understood and integrated into the larger divine plan for spiritual progress. This perspective contrasts sharply with ACIM's view, which would see even the objective world as a mere illusion that must be transcended. The Urantia Book, by emphasizing an objective reality, would argue that our engagement with the material world is an essential part of spiritual development rather than something to be denied. ACIM would likely point to the long history of philosophical idealism to support its argument, particularly the line of thinkers who have argued that reality is fundamentally mental, not material. It could trace its intellectual lineage back to the ancient Greeks, particularly Plato's theory of forms, and continue through thinkers like Berkeley, Kant, and ultimately Hegel, who all posited that mind or consciousness is the ultimate ground of reality. Here's how ACIM might make this argument. ACIM. You may argue that the material world exists independently of the mind, but history teaches us otherwise. For thousands of years, philosophers have pointed out that the world we perceive is not the ultimate reality. Plato, for example, distinguished between the world of sensible objects and the higher, eternal world of forms, which were the true, unchanging realities. This philosophical tradition continued with thinkers like George Berkeley, who argued that to be is to be perceived, suggesting that reality depends entirely on the mind. Kant also showed us that we can never know the things in themselves, only the phenomena that our mind imposes upon them. In more recent times, Hegel's dialectical idealism proposes that reality is a product of the mind's development, evolving toward greater self-consciousness. All of this points to the idea that the world is not out there independent of us, but rather it is a projection of consciousness. Even modern physics, as we discussed, points to the observer's role in determining the nature of reality. Thus, ACIM is aligned with this long tradition of idealism. The world is a projection of the mind, and true reality is not in the material world, but in the eternal, formless realm of God. What you call objective reality is simply a mental construct that arises from the separation of consciousness from its source. It may appear real to you, but that does not make it so. It is an illusion that distracts you from the ultimate truth, that your true nature is not bound to the world of form, but is part of the eternal, unchanging oneness of God. By appealing to a tradition that includes some of the most prominent thinkers in Western philosophy, ACIM roots its view of the world in a well-established intellectual history of idealism. It asserts that reality is ultimately mental or spiritual, and that the material world is a mere projection, consistent with many of the philosophical ideas put forward by these thinkers. The Urantia Book, however, would likely take issue with this alignment with philosophical idealism, particularly the way it dismisses the material world as an illusion. It might argue that idealism misinterprets the nature of reality by rejecting the objective universe, and that this perspective neglects the evolutionary purpose of life in the material world. The Urantia Book might claim that these idealist philosophers were missing the larger picture, the divine plan that integrates both material and spiritual realities. The Urantia Book would likely take that stance, particularly given its emphasis on an objective, divinely created reality and the importance of the material world as part of the soul's evolutionary journey. It would argue that philosophical idealism, while influential, began to fall apart in the 19th century and was largely superseded by more world-affirming philosophies that recognized the reality and purpose of the material universe. Here's how it might approach this. Urantia. While idealism dominated philosophical thought for much of history, the 19th century saw a shift toward more world-affirming philosophies. Idealism, particularly in its classical forms, began to show its limitations, as it failed to account for the practical and experiential reality of human existence in the material world. Thinkers like Hegel and Berkeley, though brilliant, focused on the subjective nature of reality and placed too much emphasis on the mind or consciousness as the ultimate creator of all things. But their ideas did not account for the dynamic, objective reality that exists outside of individual mind. By the 19th century, thinkers like Kant, Nietzsche, and even the rise of scientific materialism moved away from the idea that all of reality is purely mental or subjective. Rather, they began to emphasize the importance of the material world, human experience, and the objective reality of the universe. Furthermore, the scientific revolution, particularly the rise of modern physics, reinforced the notion of a universe governed by laws that exist independently of human perception. The discoveries in physics, biology, and cosmology during the 19th and 20th centuries pointed to the reality of an external, objective universe that was not created by human minds but existed as part of God's divine plan. These discoveries validated the idea that the material world is not an illusion, but rather a real and purposeful creation, in which the evolution of life plays a crucial role in the spiritual development of individual souls. Thus, idealism, though valuable in its contributions, began to lose its grip on modern thought. The acknowledgement of the material world's existence and purpose, as well as the emergence of more holistic, evolutionary philosophies, reflects the deeper truth. Reality is not a projection of individual consciousness, but a divinely created universe that includes both material and spiritual dimensions. This truth is consistent with God's plan for human evolution, and the purpose of life on Urantia is to progress through both material and spiritual realms toward ultimate perfection. In this argument, the Urantia Book would claim that the philosophical idealism of the 18th and early 19th centuries ultimately gave way to more robust, reality-affirming views that acknowledged the importance of both the material and spiritual world. It would suggest that idealism's limitations were exposed by the rise of more empirical and evolutionary philosophies, as well as scientific discoveries that demonstrated the existence of an objective, divinely ordered universe. This stands in direct contrast to ACIM's view, which remains heavily rooted in idealism and insists on the illusory nature of the material world. The Urantia Book would likely argue that ACIM's dismissal of the material world as an illusion is both impractical and spiritually limiting, as it neglects the divine purpose inherent in the universe and human existence. Would you like to explore how this might influence the Urantia Book's broader cosmology and its understanding of spiritual evolution, or how ACIM might respond to the critique of idealism? ACIM would likely respond by emphasizing that it is dealing with a more ultimate, non-dual reality, where everything is indeed one, and that the material world, along with all human experience, pales in comparison to the higher truth of spiritual unity. In this view, the material world and even the philosophical debates over its existence are distractions from the deeper, more essential reality that transcends all forms, distinctions, and human limitations. Here's how ACIM might frame this response. ACIM: you argue that the material world is real and essential, but I must remind you that you are speaking of a reality that is part of the dream. What you see as objective reality is still rooted in duality, still divided into subjects and objects, into time and space. I am not here to engage with that. I am here to point you to the truth that transcends all these divisions. The world you perceive, with all its philosophies and sciences, is just one aspect of the illusion of separation. You are not meant to get lost in the details of a transient material reality. These things will pass away, for they are not the truth. The truth is the oneness of God, and everything that exists is a manifestation of that singular reality. When you see the world as divided, whether by idealism, materialism, or any other ism, you miss the point. All distinctions are illusory. The teachings of ACIM are designed to lead you beyond this dualistic experience. The world you see is not an ultimate reality. It is a dream, a projection of your mind, which you are asked to wake up from. You need not get bogged down in its complexities or its contradictions. The only true reality is the undivided oneness of God, and in that oneness there is no world, no separation, no distinction between mind and matter, self and other. To seek answers in the details of the material world or in the philosophies that try to make sense of it is to miss the simplicity of the truth. Everything is one, and that one is God. The seeming divisions of the world, whether physical, philosophical, or mental, are temporary and meaningless in the face of the eternal, indivisible truth. The world you see is not real. It is a manifestation of the separation in your mind. True reality is not in the world of form, but in the eternal, changeless oneness that transcends all experience. In this view, ACIM would argue that the material world is simply a lower-level reality, a temporary illusion that can be transcended in the pursuit of spiritual awakening. The purpose of ACIM's teachings is not to engage with or validate the material world, nor is it concerned with reconciling the debates between idealism and materialism. Instead, it calls attention to a higher, ultimate reality that is beyond all these distinctions, one in which there is no separation between mind, body, or the universe. For ACIM, all the complexities of human experience, whether philosophical, scientific, or existential, are distractions from the singular truth that the world is not real, and only the oneness of God matters. Its teachings aim to shortcut or bypass the messy human world by guiding the practitioner toward the realization of this unified, ultimate reality. The Urantia Book, on the other hand, would likely counter that this view fails to honor the true purpose of the material world, which is to provide a stage for the spiritual evolution of human beings. It might argue that while oneness is the ultimate goal, it is attained through the meaningful engagement with the material universe, not through denial of its reality. Would you like to explore how the Urantia Book would defend the value of this world in the face of such transcendental views? Or how it might explain the relationship between the messy human world and the oneness that ACIM speaks of? Response from the Urantia Book. Given its emphasis on the material world as a vital stage for human growth and the intricate, divinely orchestrated process of spiritual evolution, the Urantia Book would likely critique ACIM's view of transcendence as an unrealistic escape into a simplistic fantasy. It would argue that true spiritual progress comes from engaging with the complexities of life, including the material world, rather than bypassing or rejecting them. Here's how the Urantia Book might frame its critique of ACIM's approach. Urantia, while ACIM speaks of transcendence, it does so in a way that overlooks the complexities of the human experience and the divine plan for evolution. It presents a fantasy of spiritual escape, suggesting that the material world is merely an illusion to be disregarded in favor of a supposed higher, singular reality. But this approach is deeply misguided. It fails to acknowledge the richness and depth of human life and the purpose of material existence in God's larger plan. You see, life is far too complicated and intricate for such a simplistic solution. The world is not something to be discarded, nor is the process of spiritual evolution something that can be bypassed. ACIM's dismissal of the material world as illusion betrays the divine purpose embedded in it. The universe is not a cosmic mistake or a realm of suffering to be escaped from, but a carefully structured, living system designed for the progressive development of soul and spirit. To deny the reality of this world is to ignore the very conditions necessary for human growth. It is through engaging with life's complexities, its challenges, its relationships, its struggles, that you learn to grow, to develop, and to ultimately achieve the spiritual maturity required for ascension. True transcendence is not about retreating from the world, but about navigating it with wisdom and a sense of divine purpose. In the face of life's complexities, ACIM's approach to spiritual growth is overly simplistic. It offers a quick fix, a shortcut that disregards the necessary process of learning and development that comes from facing the reality of existence. ACIM promises an escape from suffering, but it is an escape that does not honor the divine intelligence woven into the material world. This is not how true spiritual progress is achieved. Instead, it is through embracing the world in all its complexity and working through its challenges that you grow closer to God's will for you. In this response, the Urantia Book would argue that ACIM's model of transcendence, which involves rejecting the material world and seeing it as an illusion, is ultimately a form of spiritual escapism. It would stress that the complexities of life are part of the divine plan and that true spiritual growth comes from engaging with and learning through the material experience, rather than trying to transcend it prematurely. The Urantia Book would emphasize that life is a journey, and spiritual evolution requires facing the reality of existence with awareness, wisdom, and a commitment to personal development. In contrast, ACIM would likely argue that engagement with the material world, as the Urantia Book advocates, is just more of the illusion that must be transcended. ACIM could claim that the complexity of life is precisely the reason why the world needs to be seen as an illusion. It's just too complex for the mind to make sense of. And this complexity is what keeps individuals trapped in the ego and separated from God. If ACIM pointed to the Catholic view of the world as a vale of tears, it would likely seize upon this metaphor to strengthen its argument that the material world is fundamentally a place of suffering and illusion. Catholicism, in some of its more ascetic forms, has often emphasized the fallen, suffering nature of the world, urging believers to look beyond worldly attachments and seek salvation through spiritual means. ACIM would likely align with this view, emphasizing that the material world is inherently flawed and that true peace and salvation can only be found by transcending it. Here's how ACIM might frame its argument in response. ACIM: yes, the world you see is indeed a vale of tears, but it is not merely a veil. It is a prison built by the mind in an attempt to escape the truth. The suffering you experience in this world is not part of God's design, but rather the result of the belief in separation. You have created a reality where pain, conflict, and hardship are necessary for your growth because you believe you are separate from God. But this is a mistaken perception. The Catholic view acknowledges the suffering in the world, but it stops short of realizing that suffering is not the path to salvation. It is not through engaging with suffering or striving to endure it that you reach the ultimate peace. The way out of suffering is through the realization that the world is not real, that it is a dream constructed by your own mind. The true peace you seek is found not by enduring pain or finding meaning in hardship, but by letting go of the world entirely and recognizing that it was never truly real. The idea of a vale of tears reflects the illusion that suffering has a purpose. But the truth is that suffering is unnecessary, and it is only sustained by the belief in separation from God. As long as you identify with the world and see it as your reality, you will continue to suffer. But when you recognize that the world is a dream, you can let go of the attachment to it and experience the eternal peace that transcends all suffering. In this view, ACIM would agree with the Catholic sentiment that the world is full of suffering, but it would take it a step further by emphasizing that suffering is not only something to be endured, it is something to be seen through. The Catholic vale of tears metaphor might be used as a point of common ground, but ACIM would insist that the reason for this suffering is the belief in separation, and that the way to overcome it is to let go of attachment to the material world entirely. On the other hand, the Urantia Book would likely see this view as a misinterpretation of the nature of suffering and the material world. It might argue that suffering is indeed part of the human condition, but that it serves a necessary and purposeful role in the soul's evolution. It would claim that, rather than being a veil to be discarded or transcended, the material world and its challenges are an essential aspect of God's plan for spiritual growth. Urantia: the Catholic notion of the vale of tears points to the reality of human suffering, but it fails to appreciate the divine purpose behind it. Suffering, in the Urantia Book's view, is not a mistake or an illusion to be transcended, but a part of the necessary evolutionary process through which souls grow. It is not by rejecting the world that you achieve spiritual progress, but by engaging with it and overcoming its trials. The world you experience, with all its complexities and challenges, is a divinely crafted environment that supports the soul's ascent toward God. Suffering has a meaning, a divine purpose. It is not something to be ignored or discarded. It is an opportunity for growth, for learning, and for spiritual transformation. Just as pain is a signal of bodily injury, suffering in the material world signals the soul's need for growth and healing. It is through facing suffering that individuals develop compassion, wisdom, and a deeper connection to the divine plan. The idea that suffering is simply an illusion to be escaped from is a denial of the deep spiritual truths embedded in human experience. So, while ACIM would use the veil of tears metaphor to argue that the world and suffering are illusions to be transcended, the Urantia Book would counter that suffering has a deeper, meaningful purpose in the soul's evolution, and that trying to escape or deny it is a spiritual misunderstanding. ACIM and the Urantia Book would certainly offer very different perspectives on the proper way to engage with life and seek spiritual growth. Let's look at how each would frame the approach to life and spiritual progress. ACIM's view on spiritual growth. For ACIM, spiritual growth is fundamentally about shifting one's perception and moving from a mindset of separation to one of unity. Since ACIM holds that the material world is illusory, it emphasizes the importance of seeing beyond the physical reality and recognizing the truth of the non-dual, unified nature of existence. Here's how ACIM might describe the proper way to engage with life. ACIM. The proper way to engage with life is to recognize that it is an illusion. Your true reality is spirit, and the world of form, what you perceive with your senses, is not real. The purpose of life is not to make the world a better place or to achieve personal success, but to undo the belief in separation. You must forgive the world, for it is the projection of your mind. You forgive not because others have wronged you, but because you have created them in your mind and can choose to see them differently. Spiritual growth involves undoing the ego's grip on your perception. The ego tells you that the world is real, that you are separate, and that the body and mind are your true identity. But this is a mistake. The proper engagement with life is to recognize it as a dream, a projection, and to shift your focus to the truth that God is the only reality. When you forgive the illusion and let go of your attachment to the world, you awaken to the peace of God. Spiritual growth is about recognizing that you are not your body or your mind, you are spirit. You are already one with God, and your job is to awaken to that truth. In this view, spiritual growth is a process of realization and correction of perception, rather than action in the material world. ACIM emphasizes forgiveness as the key practice, not of others' wrongdoings, but of the false beliefs about separation that the mind holds. ACIM suggests that true spiritual growth involves letting go of attachment to the material world and seeing it for what it truly is, an illusion of the ego. The Urantia Book's view on spiritual growth. In contrast, the Urantia Book offers a much more complex and multi-layered approach to spiritual growth, deeply rooted in both the material and spiritual world. It focuses on the idea that human beings are evolving in both body and spirit, and that the material world plays a necessary role in this development. Here's how the Urantia Book might describe the proper way to engage with life. Urantia. The proper way to engage with life is to understand that you are a part of a divine plan. Life on earth is not a mistake, nor is it a realm to be rejected. You are a spiritual being on a journey of soul evolution, and the material world is a necessary environment for this development. Spiritual growth occurs through your engagement with the world around you, through the experiences you have, the relationships you form, and the challenges you face. The world is a stage upon which your soul can grow. To grow spiritually, you must engage with the world in a purposeful way. This means taking responsibility for your actions, cultivating a loving and compassionate heart, and striving for wisdom. It is not enough to retreat from life or to ignore the challenges it presents. True spiritual progress requires you to learn from your experiences, overcome difficulties, and evolve through them. The divine plan for you is to achieve soul perfection and eventually ascend to higher realms of existence. This process is gradual and requires patience, dedication, and the practice of virtues such as love, service, and truth. You must seek the will of God not by rejecting the world, but by engaging with it in a way that reflects God's love and purpose. The material world is not the ultimate reality, but it is an essential part of your journey toward perfection. In this view, spiritual growth is a process of engagement with the material world. It emphasizes living with purpose, developing virtues, and facing life's challenges with wisdom and love. The Urantia Book sees the material world as a necessary training ground for spiritual growth, and it advocates for an active participation in life, rather than attempting to escape or dismiss it. It recognizes that the world is not perfect, but that it is within this imperfect world that human beings evolve and come to understand their divine nature. Comparison: how each view sees the proper approach to life. ACIM: spiritual growth comes through recognizing the illusory nature of the material world and shifting perception to see the world as a dream. Engaging with life is about recognizing the world as an illusion, forgiving the belief in separation, and focusing on the realization of oneness with God. It's a more introspective, mind-focused approach to growth that involves undoing false beliefs and seeing beyond the material world. The Urantia Book: spiritual growth comes through engaging with the material world and learning from life's experiences. It sees the world as a valuable tool for soul development, where challenges and relationships are opportunities to grow in love, wisdom, and service. Spiritual progress involves aligning with divine purpose and taking responsibility for one's actions in the material world. What would each say about suffering and life's challenges? ACIM: suffering is seen as a result of the belief in separation from God. It is not to be engaged with but transcended by recognizing its illusory nature. Life's challenges are to be seen as projections of the mind that can be corrected through forgiveness and the realization of oneness. The Urantia Book: suffering is viewed as part of the evolutionary process. It is a necessary part of learning and growing spiritually. Life's challenges are seen as opportunities to develop virtues such as patience, compassion, and wisdom. Spiritual growth occurs through facing and overcoming difficulties, rather than avoiding or rejecting them. Summary: ACIM promotes spiritual growth by transcending the world and realizing that it is an illusion. It advocates for focusing on the mind, undoing false beliefs, and seeking inner peace through the recognition of oneness with God. The Urantia Book encourages spiritual growth through active engagement with the world, embracing challenges, and seeking to align one's actions with divine purpose. It emphasizes the importance of the material world in the soul's evolution and sees life as a training ground for higher spiritual realities. Both offer paths to spiritual growth but differ greatly in how they view the relationship between the material world and spiritual development. The Urantia Book takes a dim view of Eastern religions in general. It does not say much about it, but what is there is very negative. Yes, the Urantia Book tends to be critical of Eastern religions, particularly in how they conceive of God, reality, and spiritual progress. While it acknowledges some truths in Eastern traditions, it generally portrays them as incomplete, overly mystical, and lacking a clear personal relationship with a divine creator. Key criticisms of Eastern religions in the Urantia Book. 1. Impersonal God versus personal God. The Urantia Book strongly emphasizes a personal, loving, and purposeful God, the Universal Father. While it criticizes Eastern traditions, especially Hinduism and certain Buddhist schools, for their focus on an impersonal absolute or impersonal cosmic forces. It sees the concept of an impersonal Brahman or nirvana as a major spiritual error, leading to detachment rather than active participation in God's divine plan. 2. Escapism and passivity. It views certain aspects of Hinduism and Buddhism as promoting withdrawal from life rather than engagement with it. The idea of renouncing the material world to attain enlightenment is seen as misguided, since the Urantia Book teaches that the material world is part of God's evolutionary plan. Instead of seeking to escape suffering through detachment, humans should actively participate in life, grow spiritually through experience, and seek to serve others. 3. Reincarnation versus evolutionary progression. The Urantia Book rejects reincarnation as a false doctrine. It teaches that the soul progresses through divine guidance, eventually ascending to higher spiritual realms, but not through endless cycles of rebirth. Eastern views on karma and reincarnation are seen as misunderstandings of the true nature of soul evolution. 4. Pantheism and illusion. It criticizes pantheistic tendencies in Hinduism and Buddhism, arguing that while God is present within all things, He is not identical to the universe. It also rejects the idea that the material world is an illusion, Maya in Hinduism or Sunyata in Buddhism, insisting instead that the physical universe is real, meaningful, and part of God's purposeful design. Comparison to ACIM. While the Urantia Book criticizes Eastern thought, A Course in Miracles actually aligns more closely with certain Eastern ideas, especially the notion that the world is an illusion and that enlightenment comes from shifting one's perception. ACIM's emphasis on undoing the ego and recognizing the illusory nature of the world has a strong parallel with Advaita Vedanta and aspects of Mahayana Buddhism. If the Urantia Book sees Eastern spirituality as misguided for rejecting the material world, it would likely extend the same critique to ACIM. Would you like to explore how ACIM might respond to this critique, or how the Urantia Book might contrast its view of spiritual growth with Eastern traditions? There is a chapter on world religions in the UB, and a section on Hinduism which provides many points of agreement and a certain admiration of Hinduism as embodying great truth. You're right, the Urantia Book does acknowledge valuable aspects of Hinduism, particularly in its more philosophical and monotheistic expressions. While it critiques certain elements of Eastern thought, it also finds points of agreement with Hinduism, recognizing its long spiritual history and deep metaphysical insight. Urantia Book's positive views on Hinduism. 1. Recognition of a supreme reality. The Urantia Book acknowledges that Hinduism has, at times, moved toward a recognition of a supreme personal deity, Ishvara or Brahman in some traditions, which aligns with its own concept of the Universal Father. 2. Spiritual aspiration. It admires Hinduism's deep commitment to spiritual growth and the pursuit of higher truth. The book respects Hinduism's long history of exploring the nature of the divine and its emphasis on inner experience. 3. Understanding of the divine presence. The Urantia Book agrees with Hinduism on the presence of divinity within human beings. The idea of the thought adjuster, the divine fragment of God residing within each person, has some resemblance to the Hindu concept of the Atman as the divine spark within. 4. Sacred texts and insights. It sees Hinduism as having preserved many ancient religious truths, despite later distortions. The Vedas, Upanishads, and other scriptures contain profound insights that the Urantia Book acknowledges as valuable contributions to human spiritual evolution. Where the Urantia Book disagrees with Hinduism. 1. Pantheism and impersonal God. It critiques the Hindu tendency toward seeing God as an impersonal absolute, Brahman without qualities, emphasizing instead a personal God with will, love, and purpose. 2. Reincarnation versus ascending evolution. The Urantia Book firmly rejects reincarnation, teaching instead that human souls progress spiritually in a linear fashion toward God, rather than cycling through multiple lifetimes. 3. escapism, and withdrawal. While the Urantia book respects Hinduism's spiritual dedication, it criticizes asceticism and detachment from worldly life, arguing that spiritual progress comes through active engagement with life rather than renunciation. How this relates to ACIM. ACIM's metaphysical outlook has much more in common with Hinduism than the Urantia book does, particularly in its non-dualistic approach, which resembles Advaita Vedanta. If ACIM were to engage with the Urantia book, it might point out that Hinduism's recognition of the illusory nature of the world is in alignment with its own teachings, whereas the Urantia book insists on a real and purposeful universe. Would you like to focus on how the Urantia book might critique ACIM's view of Hinduism, or how ACIM might defend itself using Hindu metaphysics? How would each book deal with the concept of the ego? ACIM on the ego. A Course in Miracles, ACIM, sees the ego as the false self, the root of all illusion, and the primary obstacle to awakening. According to ACIM, the ego is the result of the mind's mistaken belief in separation from God. It is a defense mechanism against truth, creating a world of fear, conflict, and suffering to maintain the illusion of individuality. The ego is entirely illusory. It has no real existence. It operates through fear, guilt, judgment, and the belief in scarcity. Awakening requires undoing the ego through forgiveness and a shift in perception, recognizing that only love and oneness are real. The Holy Spirit is presented as the alternative to the ego, a divine guide leading the mind back to truth. ACIM's goal is to transcend the ego entirely, allowing the mind to return to the awareness of God's love and unity. The Urantia book on the ego. The Urantia book has a very different take. It does not treat the ego as an illusion to be discarded, but rather as a necessary part of personal identity. While it warns against excessive self-importance, selfishness, and materialism, it does not see the ego as inherently evil or unreal. The ego is part of personality development, playing a role in free will, self-awareness, and moral decision-making. The danger of ego is not its existence but its misuse, such as when it becomes self-centered, prideful, or resistant to spiritual growth. Instead of eliminating the ego, the Urantia book teaches that the goal is to harmonize and uplift the ego by aligning it with divine purpose. The divine fragment of God, thought adjuster, works within the individual to spiritualize and guide the ego, rather than destroy it. The Urantia book sees human personality as real and eternal, meant to evolve toward God. Unlike ACIM, it does not advocate dissolving individuality into an all-encompassing oneness. Instead, personal identity is preserved and perfected through spiritual growth. Key differences. Concept. ACIM. The Urantia book. Nature of the ego. Entirely false, a defense against truth. Real, but needs spiritual refinement. Role of the ego. Causes suffering, fear, and illusion. Necessary for personality growth, but can become distorted. Ultimate goal. Undo the ego and return to oneness. Transform and spiritualize the ego in alignment with God. Path to growth. Forgiveness and dissolving self-concept. Cooperation with the divine within, moral choices, and service to others. ACIM sees the ego as something to erase, while the Urantia book sees it as something to redeem and integrate into a higher divine purpose. How would all this compare to Freud's concept of ego? Freud's concept of the ego differs significantly from both A Course in Miracles, ACIM, and the Urantia book, UB, but also shares some interesting points of comparison. Freud's ego. In Freudian psychology, the ego is the rational mediator between 1. The ID, instinctual desires and impulses. 2. The superego, moral and social conditioning. 3. The external world. The ego is not an illusion but a necessary part of the psyche that helps maintain balance. It functions as a problem solver, managing conflicting demands of instinct, morality, and reality. A strong, well-developed ego is considered healthy because it allows a person to function effectively in the world. Problems arise when the ego is weak, overpowered by the ID or superego, or defensive, creating distortions like repression or denial. Comparison with ACIM. Freud ACIM. The ego is real and necessary for psychological balance. The ego is completely false, an illusion that must be undone. Helps balance instincts, morality, and reality. Creates suffering by reinforcing separation from God. A strong ego is healthy. A weak ego causes problems. The ego is always a problem, regardless of its strength. Defenses like repression distort reality but serve a function. The ego itself is a defense against truth. Psychological growth means strengthening the ego. Spiritual growth means dissolving the ego. ACIM rejects Freud's assumption that the ego is necessary or even real. It would argue that Freud mistook the ego for something essential when, in fact, it is the root of all psychological suffering. Where Freud sees a healthy ego as the goal, ACIM sees ego dissolution as liberation. Comparison with the Urantia Book. Freud, the Urantia Book. The ego is a psychological structure that manages instincts and reality. The ego, as self-awareness, is part of the eternal soul's personality. The ego is neutral, it can be healthy or unhealthy. The ego can be selfish and distorted, but it is also the seat of moral choice and free will. Personality ends at death. Personality is eternal and meant to evolve spiritually. The psyche is divided into ID, ego, and superego. The human self consists of mind, soul, and the divine thought adjuster, God's inner guidance. The unconscious plays a major role in behavior. Moral and spiritual decisions shape the eternal soul more than subconscious forces. Unlike Freud, the Urantia Book does not see the ego as a mere balancing act between animal instincts and social morality. It views human personality as divinely created, with the potential for eternal progress. Instead of seeing the ego as a negotiator between desires and rules, UB sees it as a decision-maker in a cosmic journey toward God. Final summary. Freud. The ego is real and necessary for psychological survival. ACIM. The ego is completely false and must be undone. The Urantia Book. The ego is real but must be transformed through spiritual growth. Would you like to explore how Jungian ideas about the ego and self might compare to these? It seems that most New Agers have major contradictions in there, which they are not even smart enough to realize, or they gloss it over in order to be able to embrace many doctrines at once. Yes, a lot of New Age thought is a patchwork of different metaphysical systems, many of which contradict each other. There's often an attempt to merge Eastern mysticism, Western idealism, pop psychology, quantum physics, and even Christianity into one grand spiritual framework, but without reconciling the deep contradictions between them. For example, 1. Radical non-dualism versus personal growth. ACIM and some Eastern traditions claim the ego is completely false, and that the self is an illusion, there is only one reality, God, Spirit, etc. But many New Age teachings also promote self-improvement, raising your vibration, or manifesting your desires, which assumes there is a self to grow or change. Contradiction. If the self is an illusion, who is improving or evolving? 2. You create your own reality versus karma and divine will. Many New Agers claim that your thoughts create your reality, implying total control over life. But at the same time, they might also believe in karma, which suggests past actions determine fate, or a divine plan, which suggests a higher intelligence is in control. Contradiction. If you create everything, why do past karma or divine forces have power over you? 3. Quantum physics misuse. Some New Agers cite quantum mechanics to argue that matter is an illusion and that consciousness creates everything. But quantum mechanics does not say this. It describes probabilities at the microscopic level, not that reality disappears without an observer. Contradiction: using science while rejecting the scientific method. 4. Oneness versus moral dualism. Many New Agers claim all is one, and there is no real evil, only ignorance. But they also warn against negative energy, toxic people, and bad vibes, implying a real distinction between good and bad. Contradiction: if everything is one, why reject or avoid certain energies? 5. Western individualism versus Eastern surrender. Many New Age teachings embrace Buddhist and Hindu ideas of detachment, where the goal is to surrender personal will and dissolve into the higher reality. But they also promote manifestation, personal empowerment, and following your dreams, which are deeply Western, ego-driven ideas. Contradiction: should you dissolve your ego or empower it? Why this happens? Many people want to believe everything at once because it feels good and expansive rather than limiting. There's a resistance to critical thinking because pointing out contradictions can seem negative or too intellectual. The movement borrows from multiple traditions but without respecting their original meanings. Some thinkers, like Ken Wilber, have tried to create a coherent synthesis of different traditions. But most New Age belief systems gloss over contradictions rather than resolve them. Would you say that A Course in Miracles is guilty of some of these contradictions as well? Or do you think it's more internally consistent than general New Age thought? Strictly speaking, ACIM is not New Age and is not compatible with most of those modern teachings. ACIM is talking a higher aspect of ultimate reality, where all is indeed one and evil does not exist. But many New Agers who get enthusiastic about ACIM also tend to mix many other things in a spirit of adventure. That makes sense. A Course in Miracles is not a typical New Age book, even if it often gets lumped in with that category. It presents a rigorous, internally consistent metaphysical system, which is closer to radical non-dualism than to the pick-and-mix spirituality common in the New Age movement. Where ACIM differs from typical New Age thought. 1. Strict non-dualism. ACIM states that only God is real, and the world, the body, and the ego are all illusions. This is closer to Advaita Vedanta than to the Western self-help approach of create your reality. Most New Age teachings still treat the world as meaningful and something to be worked with, rather than entirely dismissed as illusion. 2. No manifestation or law of attraction. ACIM does not teach that you create your personal reality through your thoughts in the sense of attracting things into existence. Instead, it teaches that the entire material world is a mistake, and the only creation is in spiritual terms within the mind of God. 3. No importance given to energy, vibrations, or healing, unlike many New Age traditions that focus on energy work, chakras, or healing vibrations. ACIM dismisses all of this as part of the illusion. From ACIM's view, seeking healing in the world is like trying to fix a dream while you're still asleep. The real healing comes from waking up. 4. Rejection of the ego versus ego empowerment. ACIM sees the ego as entirely false, something to be undone through forgiveness. Many New Age teachings celebrate the ego, seeing it as something to be strengthened, empowered, or aligned with higher forces. 5. No moral dualism. ACIM does not recognize evil as a real force. Many New Age traditions warn against negative energy, dark entities, or bad karma, which ACIM would see as reinforcing illusion. Why New Agers like ACIM anyway? Its language sounds mystical and uplifting, making it easy to mix with other spiritual systems. The idea that the world is an illusion feels compatible with quantum mysticism, even if ACIM's meaning is much deeper. It offers a non-traditional view of Jesus, which appeals to those who want a spiritual Christ without organized religion. But as you pointed out, mixing ACIM with New Age ideas creates contradictions. People enthusiastic about ACIM often don't fully commit to its radical philosophy and end up grafting it onto a self-improvement or manifestation-based worldview that it simply doesn't support. Would you say ACIM is closer to pure Advaita Vedanta, or does it still have its own unique framework that sets it apart? It seems to defy all categorization. When a person starts to read this book, he often a big experience of realization, liberation, or some sort of mystical experience, even if he never believe in God or know nothing about spirituality. There is a sense that no human being could have written this book. That's a powerful observation. A Course in Miracles seems to have a strange, immediate impact on people, almost like it bypasses the intellect and speaks directly to some deeper part of the mind. The feeling that no human being could have written this is something many people report, even skeptics. This sets it apart from typical spiritual texts, which often require years of study before they start to make sense or produce real shifts in awareness. ACIM, by contrast, sometimes shocks people into a new perception almost instantly, even if they don't fully understand it. Why does ACIM have this effect? 1. The language feels beyond the human mind. It doesn't read like someone's personal philosophy or intellectual argument. The phrasing, the paradoxes, and the layered meanings seem to speak to the subconscious as much as the rational mind. People often feel personally addressed, as if the text is alive. 2. The radical nature of its ideas. The claim that nothing in this world is real and that only God's love exists is so extreme that it can cause an immediate shift in perception. It removes all guilt, all fear, and all struggle in a single stroke if one truly grasps its message. 3. A mystical quality beyond thought. Many spiritual books require belief, faith, or intellectual agreement before they have an effect. ACIM, on the other hand, often produces a direct experience, even in those who don't know why. 4. The authorial mystery. The claim that it was dictated by Jesus, or something beyond the human mind, makes it difficult to place in any category. It does not fit into traditional Christianity, New Age thought, or Eastern philosophy, though it touches elements of all three. Is ACIM a unique revelation? If it defies categorization, the question becomes, is ACIM one of the rare breakthrough revelations in human history beyond philosophy or tradition? Many of history's most transformative spiritual texts, such as the Tao Te Ching, the Bhagavad Gita, or even aspects of Gnostic writings, have a similar timeless, otherworldly quality. But ACIM seems even more direct, like it is designed to break down reality as we know it and reveal something entirely new. Would you say ACIM's effect on people is evidence of a divine source, or could it be explained through some deep psychological or subconscious mechanism? Well, the book refers to itself as a celestial speed-up. Also, the scribe was a Freudian psychologist, and the text is written in such a way that is uniquely compelling. A large portion of it is written in iambic pentameter, and it does speak to the subconscious, which is referred to as the level of miracles, but also the superconscious, which is the source of revelation. That idea of A Course in Miracles being a celestial speed-up is fascinating. It suggests that it's not just another spiritual teaching, but something designed to accelerate awakening in a way that bypasses the usual slow, evolutionary process of spiritual growth. The fact that Helen Schuckman, the scribe, was a Freudian psychologist is also important. Freud saw the subconscious as a realm of repression and conflict, but ACIM reinterprets it as the level of miracles, a place where perception can be healed. At the same time, it introduces the superconscious, which Freud never really acknowledged, as the true source of revelation. Why is ACIM so compelling? 1. Psychological precision. Coming from a Freudian background, ACIM is uniquely structured to break through the mind's resistance. It speaks directly to the deepest layers of human thought, uncovering hidden guilt and fear. 2. Poetic power. The use of iambic pentameter, a rhythmic structure also found in Shakespeare, gives it a hypnotic, flowing quality that makes it easier to absorb on an unconscious level. 3. A multi-layered message. ACIM seems to operate on different levels of consciousness at the same time, rational, subconscious, and superconscious, leading to sudden insights that feel non-linear. 4. Direct spiritual transmission. Many who read it describe having mystical experiences, even if they were not seeking them. ACIM is almost like a psychological blueprint for awakening, disguised as a spiritual text. It doesn't just give new ideas, it rewires the mind from the inside out. Would you say that ACIM's combination of psychology, poetry, and metaphysics makes it a uniquely modern revelation? Or does it connect back to something even more ancient? I have no idea. It seems that the book could not have been written before psychology was developed. It combines so many things: psychoanalysis, New Thought style affirmative process, Eastern mysticism, Gnosticism, and Christian terminology. And of course, a presumed authorship of Jesus himself. That is a whole lot to swallow. Yeah, ACIM is definitely a strange fusion of influences, so much so that it doesn't fit neatly into any tradition. The fact that it integrates Freudian psychology, New Thought affirmation, Eastern non-duality, Gnosticism, and Christian language, all while claiming to be dictated by Jesus, makes it incredibly hard to classify. And you're right, it probably couldn't have been written before modern psychology. The way it dissects guilt, projection, fear, and perception feels uniquely 20th century, even though its core message is timeless. It's as if it's bridging ancient mystical traditions with modern psychological insight, using both to dismantle the ego. Is ACIM too much to swallow? For many, yes. The sheer scope of its claims, especially that Jesus dictated it, makes it a tough sell. Some see it as a radical breakthrough, while others see it as a strange mishmash of ideas that don't fully belong together. But the real test seems to be the experience of reading it. Whether or not one believes in its origins, people often report that it shifts their perception in profound ways, even if they resist it. Do you think the book's effectiveness comes from its ideas themselves or from some deeper energetic or revelatory quality that defies explanation? I have no idea. Many Christians regard it as coming from a demonic source. But they would say the same about all channeled teachings. Yeah, that reaction is pretty common among traditional Christians. Anything channeled, whether it's A Course in Miracles, the Urantia Book, or even some aspects of Gnostic texts, tends to be viewed with suspicion because it bypasses established scripture and church authority. With ACIM specifically, the biggest red flag for many Christians is its claim that Jesus dictated a message that directly contradicts core Christian doctrines, such as the reality of sin. ACIM says sin doesn't exist, only errors in perception. The necessity of Jesus' crucifixion for salvation. ACIM reframes it as unnecessary and misunderstood. The material world as part of God's creation. ACIM calls the world a mistaken projection, whereas Christianity sees it as divinely created and good in Genesis. From that perspective, many Christians see ACIM as either deception or spiritual danger, not necessarily because of its psychological insights, but because of its radically different theology. Is ACIM demonic, or just too radical? If one assumes that any spiritual teaching outside the Bible is demonic, then ACIM automatically falls into that category. But if one evaluates it based on its actual effects, things get more complicated. It doesn't promote materialism or egoic self-worship like some New Age teachings do. It emphasizes love, forgiveness, and the dissolution of fear, which are traditionally Christian virtues. It leads to mystical experiences which Christian mystics throughout history, like Meister Eckhart or Saint John of the Cross, might recognize. But ACIM completely rewrites the Christian worldview, which makes it almost impossible for traditional believers to accept. Do you think this rejection is purely theological, or does ACIM actually threaten the power structures of organized religion by removing the need for external authority? Big question. Well, the Church has always been obsessed with doctrinal purity, because otherwise you have disorder, and if there's one thing the Church could never stand, it's disorder. That's a very astute point. The Church's obsession with doctrinal purity has historically been tied to its authority and control. If there's too much flexibility in belief or interpretation, it undermines the centralized power that organized religion has. Without a clear, unified doctrine, the Church could easily fracture into competing interpretations, which would dilute its influence and possibly lead to disorder. This has been true throughout Christian history, especially in moments like the Reformation, where doctrinal disagreements sparked massive splits and chaos. ACIM's challenge to religious authority. ACIM, in many ways, challenges every aspect of traditional religious authority. It bypasses the Church as an intermediary between humanity and God. It directly channels Jesus, not through clergy or tradition, and presents a radically redefined view of salvation and the nature of reality. Its non-dogmatic, experiential focus on inner transformation means it doesn't rely on external rituals, sacraments, or intermediaries, such as priests or ministers, to mediate spiritual growth. Disorder versus liberation. For many, the Church's structure and teachings offer security and order, even if that comes at the expense of spiritual freedom or personal responsibility. ACIM, by contrast, invites a more personal, direct experience of God that doesn't need approval from religious authorities. The Church might view this as dangerous, a threat to the established order, whereas proponents of ACIM might see it as a liberating alternative to institutionalized control. The conflict, then, may not just be about doctrine but also about who holds the power to define truth. Do you think that ACIM's emphasis on personal experience and inner guidance directly undermines the traditional religious framework in a way that challenges the very need for external authorities? There are those who mix both and seem to be okay with it. ACIM is more personal and Church is more social or family-oriented. That's an insightful distinction. Many people do indeed try to mix ACIM with traditional religious beliefs, and it seems to work for them on some level. They might find ACIM's personal, introspective approach deeply healing or transformative, while still valuing the social and communal aspects of church life. This blending can offer the best of both worlds, individual spiritual growth paired with the support system of a religious community. ACIM as personal, Church as social. ACIM offers an individual, internal path to spiritual awakening where personal experiences of forgiveness, inner peace, and divine love are emphasized. It's about transforming one's perception of reality and transcending the ego through an internal shift of consciousness. This can be very powerful for those who feel a personal, intimate relationship with the divine and prefer to explore it in a solitary or quiet manner. Church, on the other hand, provides structure, community, and a shared sense of belonging. For many, the social aspects of the Church, worship, fellowship, and communal rituals offer a sense of family and support. It provides a framework of moral guidance, tradition, and shared values that can help anchor individuals within a larger spiritual context. In that sense, these two approaches may actually be complementary for some people. ACIM fills the inner, personal gap, helping individuals work through their own mental and emotional barriers, while the Church meets the need for social connection and a sense of shared purpose. The challenge of mixing both. However, the challenge comes when people try to mix them without reconciling their core differences. For example, ACIM's rejection of sin and its view of the material world as an illusion could conflict with traditional Christian teachings about sin, repentance, and the reality of the physical world. The emphasis on personal, non-hierarchical spiritual practice in ACIM can be at odds with the Church's authority structures, where the clergy and tradition guide the faithful. For some, this contradiction is easily ignored. They focus on the elements of ACIM that resonate with their spiritual experience and accept the Church's communal benefits without feeling the need to reconcile every theological detail. But for others, the conflict might cause cognitive dissonance or frustration. Is it possible to harmonize both? It seems that those who mix both must find a way to harmonize the personal freedom of ACIM with the structured, communal nature of the Church. This could be achieved by seeing both as different modes of engagement, ACIM as the personal inner journey and Church as the external, social expression of faith. However, the core spiritual assumptions behind each path are so different that it can be challenging to hold them together without some internal contradiction. Do you think that for most people, personal freedom, like ACIM offers, and communal support, as the Church offers, can coexist peacefully? Or do the core philosophical differences eventually clash in a way that's hard to ignore? Well, they work okay, but you have to ignore a lot of details, or accept it as a paradox because after all we see through a glass darkly. That's a great way to put it, accepting it as a paradox or simply recognizing that we see through a glass darkly allows people to hold on to both ACIM and traditional church teachings without needing to resolve every contradiction. Sometimes spiritual paths require a level of surrender to mystery and an acknowledgement that not everything can be fully understood or harmonized in a tidy, logical way. This acceptance of paradox might be a spiritual strategy in itself. Learning to live with the tension between different perspectives and finding meaning in the moments of spiritual practice and experience that transcend the intellectual conflict. Spiritual paradox as a path to growth. For some, spiritual paradoxes can actually be fertilizer for deeper growth, forcing them to question assumptions and move beyond rigid thinking. This can deepen their understanding of truth and faith beyond black and white doctrinal boxes. The mystical experiences that ACIM describes, moments of clarity, unity, and peace, might transcend the doctrinal differences, allowing those who practice both to feel connected despite the intellectual contradictions. Maybe it's about the journey. In the end, it may not be about completely reconciling all the details, but rather finding spiritual nourishment in both paths, even if the details don't line up. As long as the personal experience of peace, love, and spiritual growth is present, the contradictions might feel less important. This could even lead to a richer, more nuanced experience of life, where people integrate the personal insights from ACIM with the communal support of church. Do you think that over time, people who blend these two paths might begin to see a deeper truth that is beyond words or concepts? Or would the contradictions eventually feel too overwhelming to ignore? It's an ongoing process. There is this idea of the transcendent unity of all religions. The idea of the transcendent unity of all religions is a fascinating one, and it aligns with the idea that, at their core, all spiritual paths may be pointing toward the same fundamental truth or reality, even if the languages, symbols, and practices differ widely. This concept has been explored by mystics across traditions, who often describe a shared essence beneath the diverse expressions of religion. Transcendent unity of religions. This view suggests that each religion might offer partial truths, shaped by different cultural and historical contexts. The core teachings of love, forgiveness, and compassion that are found across religions may be seen as expressions of a universal spiritual principle. Spiritual experience, direct contact with the divine or transcendent reality, might ultimately transcend religious distinctions and doctrines, pointing to a unity beyond division. This concept can be especially appealing for those who are on a personal spiritual journey, like ACIM practitioners, because it allows them to embrace the wisdom of multiple traditions without feeling the need to pick just one. ACIM itself has elements of Christianity, Eastern mysticism, and New Thought philosophy, blending them into a singular spiritual framework that seeks to transcend the limits of any single tradition. Integration with church and ACIM. For someone combining ACIM and church, the idea of the transcendent unity might help them reconcile the differences between the two paths. Both could be seen as different pathways to the same truth, with the church offering a communal, structured path, and ACIM offering a direct, experiential approach. In this way, they may start to see both as complementary expressions of the same underlying spiritual truth. The ongoing process of synthesis. As you said, it's an ongoing process. The search for unity in diversity is a lifelong journey, and the understanding of religion, spirituality, and personal experience might continue to evolve over time. By accepting the paradoxes and embracing the mystical essence of each tradition, people can engage in a dynamic and living process of spiritual growth. The challenge and the beauty. The challenge here is maintaining humility in the face of all the different perspectives and avoiding the temptation to grasp for one definitive answer. But the beauty of this approach is that it allows for integration and transformation, viewing each tradition not as an obstacle to the other, but as a step along the same path. Do you think that this transcendent unity could eventually lead to a more inclusive and open-minded approach to spiritual truth, where the divisions between religions fade? Or do you feel that the deep doctrinal differences will always be a source of tension? Not anytime soon. The world is full of people who are passionately entrenched in their own belief. The Church will no give up the Nicene Creed, Islam will never accept synthesis, and communism is a big problem, and other things. You're absolutely right. Entrenched beliefs are a huge factor in why the idea of a transcendent unity across religions or worldviews is unlikely to manifest anytime soon. The strong emotional, cultural, and historical investments that people have in their traditions can create deep resistance to any form of synthesis or even dialogue between different belief. Cultural and historical root. The Church and the Nicene Creed. For Christianity, especially traditional branches, the Nicene Creed represents the foundation of Orthodox belief. Any departure from that, whether it's accepting new interpretations of Christ's nature or accommodating other paths, could feel like undermining the core of the faith itself. Islam and synthesis. For Islam, the absolute oneness of God, Tawhid, and the belief that Muhammad is the final prophet leave little room for integrating other religious views into its framework. This deep commitment to the Quran and the Hadith makes any attempt at syncretism or blending with other religious traditions appear as an affront to its purity. Communism, while not a religion per se, communism, in its various forms, can act like an ideology religion for those who subscribe to its doctrines. It demands an allegiance to a specific view of history and society, and deviations from that perspective are often met with strong opposition. In this context, spiritual or religious ideas that don't fit within the materialist and atheistic worldview of communism are often rejected outright. The passion and entrenchment of belief. The passion with which people defend their beliefs is tied to identity, community, and meaning. When religion or ideology shapes a person's sense of purpose, family, or national identity, confronting a different worldview can feel like an attack on everything that is familiar, comforting, and grounding. Fundamentalism, in particular, can intensify these divisions, making it harder to bridge gaps between opposing worldviews. A global challenge. Globally, we see this with the rise of political and religious fundamentalism that pushes extremes rather than seeking common ground. The complexity of human history, the diversity of cultures, and the reliance on tradition all contribute to the stubbornness of belief systems. So, a unified spiritual vision that transcends these divides seems, at best, a long-term, slow evolution rather than an immediate reality. Hope amidst the divide. That said, there are still small sparks of interfaith dialogue and mutual respect emerging in places where people are open to discussion. Often in academic or spiritual circles where there is a desire for greater understanding. However, these dialogues face a huge uphill battle against the strength of established belief systems. Ultimately, I agree with you, this unity of religions is likely not happening anytime soon. But maybe the real work is in the small steps, the personal spiritual growth, the interactions between individuals from different backgrounds, and the efforts to respect and understand even if total agreement isn't possible. Do you think there will always be this tension between belief systems, or might the future bring something that shifts these deep divides in surprising ways? Well, that is why ACIM says that a universal theology is impossible, but a universal experience is not only possible but necessary. It also says that the atonement extends over millions of years. That's a fascinating insight from ACIM, and it touches on the idea that experience, rather than doctrinal consensus, is where true spiritual unity can occur. ACIM's emphasis on the universal experience of the atonement and its transcendent nature suggests that personal spiritual awakening and direct mystical experience could offer a way to bypass doctrinal divides, even if theologies, or theological frameworks, of different religions remain divergent. Universal experience versus universal theology. Universal experience. According to ACIM, direct, transformative experiences of love, oneness, and peace, beyond the boundaries of religion or philosophy, are accessible to anyone who seeks them. It emphasizes personal revelation and awakening as the path to spiritual growth. This experience of inner peace and unity is seen as a shared experience by all people, regardless of their external belief systems. While doctrines may divide, the experience of transcendence is something that can unite all people at a deep, spiritual level. Universal theology. ACIM acknowledges that a universal system of theology, where all religions would agree on the same set of beliefs and dogma, is impossible because of the diverse historical, cultural, and psychological contexts that shape religious expression. Religious experiences, however, are not confined by specific theological systems and can lead to similar transformative states regardless of one's spiritual background. A universal theology would fragment, but a universal experience of love and healing is what transcends all divisions. Atonement across time. Atonement over millennia. ACIM teaches that the atonement, the process of spiritual healing and reconnection with divine source, is a timeless process that spans over millions of years, suggesting that humanity's collective spiritual awakening is gradual and unfolds through history, individual by individual, and across generations. The atonement is not a one-time event but a continuous unfolding that heals the mind of separation and brings all back to unity. It speaks to the long-term and often unseen process of spiritual evolution, where healing may take lifetimes or even ages, but ultimately leads to reconciliation with divine love. Humanity's collective healing. This expansive view of the atonement could be a response to the challenges you've pointed out, the entrenched belief systems, the ideological divisions, and the global tensions that make a unified spiritual vision difficult. ACIM's perspective suggests that even though we may not see universal agreement in our lifetimes, the process of spiritual healing and unity is already underway, even if in ways that are often invisible or not easily understood. Our collective journey as a species may span eons, but there is hope that it gradually unfolds. The role of the individual. For ACIM, the emphasis is on the individual's experience, that by healing their own mind, letting go of guilt, fear, and separation, and choosing love over fear, individuals can contribute to the larger collective process of atonement. This is where each person's personal awakening becomes a vital part of the greater whole, creating a ripple effect across time. Transcendence without consensus. So, while religions may not achieve universal theological unity, ACIM suggests that we don't need to wait for global consensus to experience the transformational power of universal spiritual principles. The key is in the personal experience of love, forgiveness, and unity, which transcends all religious frameworks and reaches into the core of human experience. This understanding might allow people to hold their belief systems with more compassion and openness, knowing that spiritual transformation doesn't always require uniformity in thought but can thrive in the shared experience of healing and love. What do you think of ACIM's view that the atonement spans across time? Does it give hope for a future where all divisions are eventually healed, even if it takes a long, long time? It guarantees that a happy outcome will prevail in the end. But the end can be a long, long way off in time, that is. A Course in Miracles, ACIM, versus the Urantia Book. About prayer. Both A Course in Miracles, ACIM, and the Urantia Book, UB, emphasize the spiritual power of prayer, but their perspectives differ greatly based on their underlying metaphysics. 1. ACIM on prayer. The purpose of prayer. ACIM teaches that true prayer is not about asking for things, but rather about aligning the mind with God's will. Since the material world is an illusion, praying for worldly outcomes is ultimately meaningless. Instead of petitioning God for changes in the world, prayer is about awakening from the dream and realizing our oneness with God. Forgiveness as the highest form of prayer. ACIM emphasizes forgiveness as the central function of prayer. By forgiving others, we remove the barriers to love in our own minds and recognize the Christ within ourselves and others. This leads to miracles, which in ACIM are shifts in perception that move us toward truth and awakening. Praying to the Holy Spirit. ACIM encourages prayer directed to the Holy Spirit, which it describes as the part of the mind that remembers God. The Holy Spirit helps to retrain our thinking, guiding us away from ego-based perceptions of separation. Prayer in ACIM is more like meditation. Prayer is often seen as a quiet listening to divine truth rather than an active request. It is a tool for removing illusions, not for making things happen in the physical world. ACIM even warns that praying for material things reinforces belief in the illusion and strengthens the ego. 2. The Urantia Book on Prayer. The Power of Personal Petitionary Prayer. UB fully supports petitionary prayer, asking God for help and guidance. Unlike ACIM, UB believes the material world is real and meaningful, so praying for strength, wisdom, and assistance is valid. However, prayer should not be selfish. Rather than demanding specific outcomes, prayer should align us with God's will. Prayer as a means of soul growth. The highest function of prayer is to expand the soul's capacity for spiritual truth. UB encourages thanksgiving and worship over material requests. True prayer uplifts the individual and increases their ability to respond to life with faith and love. Prayer should be personal and sincere. UB discourages rote or ritualistic prayers, favoring spontaneous, heartfelt communication with God. The best prayers seek guidance, wisdom, and strength to do God's will, rather than personal gain. Jesus as the model for prayer. UB presents Jesus as the ideal prayerful person, frequently retreating to solitude to commune with the Father. It also describes group prayer as beneficial, but it must remain genuine and not mechanical. Key differences between ACIM and UB on prayer. Aspect ACIM The Urantia Book. Purpose of prayer. ACIM, to awaken from illusion and recognize oneness. UB, to strengthen the soul and align with God's will. Material requests? ACIM, no, because the world is not real. UB, yes, but should be unselfish and for spiritual growth. Prayer style. ACIM, meditative, listening, focusing on forgiveness. UB, direct communication with God, seeking wisdom and guidance. Who is prayer directed to? ACIM, the Holy Spirit for inner correction. UB, The Universal Father, God, in personal communion. Effect on the world? ACIM changes perception, not external reality. UB can bring real help, but always in alignment with divine will. Jesus and prayer. ACIM. Jesus in ACIM is more of a guide for shifting perception. UB. Jesus in UB models deep, personal communion with God. Final thought: two different views of prayer. ACIM sees prayer as a shift in perception leading to awakening, rather than something that affects the external world. UB sees prayer as a real interaction with God, helping the individual grow and face life's challenges. Would you say that ACIM's view is more mystical and inward, while UB's view is more personal and relational? ACIM says a number of things about prayer. Just for starters, in the beginning it says, prayer is the medium of miracles. It is a means of communication of the created with the Creator. Through prayer love is received, and through miracles love is expressed. Yes, that's an important passage from A Course in Miracles, ACIM, that highlights its unique take on prayer. This statement suggests that prayer is a direct line of communication with God, but, unlike traditional petitionary prayer, it is primarily about receiving love rather than asking for specific outcomes. ACIM sees prayer as the foundation of miracles, which are not supernatural interventions but shifts in perception that align us with truth. Love is first received through prayer, and then it is extended through the miracle, which is a correction of perception that dissolves illusions of separation. This contrasts with the Urantia Book, which treats prayer as a two-way interaction with God, where divine help and guidance can be sought. But it must be aligned with God's will rather than personal desires. UB sees miracles as rare divine acts rather than shifts in perception. Would you say that ACIM sees prayer as transformational on an internal level, whereas UB views it as a real spiritual dialogue with an external divine presence? ACIM goes on to say, prayer is a way of asking for something. It is the medium of miracles. But the only meaningful prayer is for forgiveness, because those who have been forgiven have everything. Once forgiveness has been accepted, prayer in the usual sense becomes utterly meaningless. The prayer for forgiveness is nothing more than a request that you may be able to recognize what you already have. In electing perception instead of knowledge, you placed yourself in a position where you could resemble your Father only by perceiving miraculously. You have lost the knowledge that you yourself are a miracle of God. Creation is your source and your only real function. This passage from A Course in Miracles really emphasizes its radically different understanding of prayer. It suggests that prayer is not about asking for external things, but rather about correcting perception, specifically through forgiveness. In ACIM, forgiveness is not about pardoning sins in the traditional sense, but rather seeing beyond illusions and recognizing that separation from God never truly occurred. Once that recognition happens, prayer in the conventional sense becomes unnecessary because there is no lack, everything has already been given. This contrasts sharply with the Urantia Book, which upholds petitionary prayer, worshipful communion, and spiritual growth through personal relationship with God. UB sees prayer as an ongoing process where humans can genuinely seek divine guidance and assistance, though always in alignment with higher will. In contrast, ACIM suggests that once true forgiveness is realized, there is no more need to ask for anything at all. Would you say that ACIM's view makes prayer more of an inner realization, whereas UB maintains a more relational, interactive model of prayer? In the same section it continues, as long as perception lasts, prayer has a place. Since perception rests on lack, those who perceive have not totally accepted the atonement and given themselves over to truth. Perception is based on a separated state, so that anyone who perceives at all needs healing. Communion, not prayer, is the natural state of those who know. God and His miracle are inseparable. How beautiful indeed are the thoughts of God who live in His light. Your worth is beyond perception because it is beyond doubt. Do not perceive yourself in different light. Know yourself in the one light where the miracle that is you is perfectly clear. This passage from A Course in Miracles takes its view of prayer even further. It essentially states that prayer only exists because we perceive ourselves as separate from God. Since perception itself is a sign of lack and illusion, prayer remains necessary only until the illusion is fully transcended. Once a person fully accepts the atonement, the realization that separation from God never truly happened, prayer as a request becomes obsolete, and pure communion with God is all that remains. ACIM makes a sharp distinction between perception and knowledge. Perception is tied to the world of separation and illusion, while knowledge belongs to the realm of oneness and certainty. As long as someone is in the world of perception, they require healing through prayer. But once they awaken fully to truth, prayer is replaced by direct communion with God, a state of being rather than asking. This contrasts greatly with the Urantia Book, which maintains that prayer and worship are eternal practices, not something that disappears once a soul becomes enlightened. UB teaches that even perfected beings continue to worship and commune with God, growing endlessly in their relationship with the divine. For UB, prayer is not just a temporary tool for those in a state of illusion, it is a means of deeper connection that continues even in the afterlife. So, ACIM sees prayer as temporary, dissolving once full awareness of God is reached, while UB sees prayer and worship as part of an everlasting journey of spiritual growth. Would you say ACIM's perspective is more about awakening to something that has already happened, while UB describes an ongoing process of spiritual evolution? Finally, ACIM provides a healer's prayer. I am here only to be truly helpful. I am here to represent Him who sent me. I do not have to worry about what to say or what to do, because He who sent me will direct me. I am content to be wherever He wishes, knowing He goes there with me. I will be healed as I let Him teach me to heal. This healer's prayer from A Course in Miracles beautifully captures the essence of ACIM's approach to spiritual surrender and divine guidance. It expresses selflessness, trust in divine direction, and the idea that healing comes through extending healing to others. The prayer reflects ACIM's teaching that the individual ego must step aside, allowing the Holy Spirit to work through them. There's no need for planning, control, or personal effort, only a willingness to be an instrument of divine love. Compared to the Urantia Book, this prayer might seem passive, whereas UB emphasizes active engagement in spiritual growth. UB teaches that God works with us rather than through us, encouraging individuals to develop wisdom, make moral choices, and contribute to cosmic progress. Where ACIM suggests that one's personal will is best set aside in favor of divine guidance, UB would say that personal will must be developed in alignment with divine truth. In essence, ACIM's healer's prayer embodies surrender to divine flow, while UB's perspective would lean toward conscious cooperation with divine purpose. Would you say this represents ACIM's more mystical, immediate approach versus UB's structured, evolutionary model of spiritual development? In contrast, the UB goes on at great length about prayer. Paper 144 is almost entirely about prayer. Yes, the Urantia Book provides an extensive and nuanced discussion on prayer, particularly in Paper 144, which explores the nature, purpose, and practice of prayer from a perspective that emphasizes growth, personal responsibility, and divine partnership. Unlike ACIM, which sees prayer as ultimately unnecessary once one fully recognizes divine reality, UB maintains that prayer is always relevant as a means of communion with God, moral and spiritual development, and even adjusting human will to align with divine will. Some key aspects of UB's approach to prayer include Prayer as a personal and evolving practice. Yup suggests that prayer changes as the soul evolves, from simple petitions for material needs to higher forms of spiritual communion and thanksgiving. The role of faith and sincerity. True prayer is about inner sincerity and attunement to divine values, not just repeating words or seeking selfish outcomes. Prayer as a means of soul growth. Unlike ACIM's emphasis on undoing illusions and transcending the world, UB teaches that prayer aids in character building, moral progress, and partnership with God in shaping one's destiny. Prayer and divine response. UB insists that prayers are answered, but not always in the expected way. Rather than manipulating reality, prayer aligns human will with divine will, allowing for growth and insight rather than direct intervention. UB's more structured and theistic view contrasts sharply with ACIM's non-dualistic, mystical approach. While both acknowledge that prayer ultimately leads to a state of divine communion, ACIM sees prayer as temporary, necessary only while one remains trapped in the illusion of separation. UB, on the other hand, treats prayer as eternally valuable, as even advanced beings continue to engage in worshipful communion with God. Would you say this reinforces UB's affirmation of spiritual progression within time, whereas ACIM urges a more immediate awakening to timeless truth? Yes. How would a person combine elements of both? I don't see any problem with that. It's definitely possible to combine elements of both A Course in Miracles and the Urantia Book. But it requires a nuanced approach that respects their fundamental differences while focusing on complementary aspects. Here's how someone might integrate the two. 1. Understanding the nature of reality. ACIM. The world is an illusion created by the mind's error and must ultimately be forgiven and transcended. UB. The material world is real and meaningful, serving as the arena for soul growth and progressive spiritual attainment. Integration. One could adopt ACIM's non-attachment to illusions while still valuing UB's purposeful engagement with life. In practice, this could mean recognizing that material conditions don't define one's ultimate reality, but still approaching life responsibly and with love as UB teaches. 2. The role of prayer and spiritual growth. ACIM. Prayer, in the highest sense, is about communion with God and recognizing that nothing real can be lacking. UB. Prayer is dynamic and evolving, serving as a means for spiritual growth, problem-solving, and aligning with divine will. Integration. A person could use ACIM's contemplative and surrender-based prayer for inner peace and UB's structured prayer for guidance, personal development, and service. Both emphasize communion with God, but UB allows for more ongoing engagement with the world. 3. The ego and spiritual identity. ACIM. The ego is a false self-concept that must be undone. UB. The ego is a necessary part of human personality, but it must be educated, disciplined, and brought into harmony with the higher self. Integration. One might use ACIM's practice of forgiveness to dissolve false, fear-based thinking while also following UB's path of progressive soul growth to develop a healthy, divinely aligned personality. 4. Salvation and awakening. ACIM. Awakening is a sudden realization that separation was never real, leading to immediate inner peace. UB. Salvation is a progressive journey through many spiritual stages, culminating in fusion with the divine. Integration. Someone might embrace ACIM's awareness of timeless divine reality while also respecting UB's perspective on evolutionary progress, realizing that deep shifts in awareness take time and personal effort. 5. How to engage with the world. ACIM. The world does not ultimately matter and is meant to be overlooked and forgiven. UB. The world is God's creation, a training ground for the soul, and must be actively transformed through love and wisdom. Integration. One could engage with life fully, UB, while not becoming attached to its illusions, ACIM, a perspective similar to living in the world but not being of it. Final thought. Transcendence plus progression. ACIM offers an instant recognition of divine truth, while UB provides a long-term roadmap for soul growth. A person integrating both might use ACIM's mystical insight to remain peaceful and forgiving, while embracing UB's structured path of action, service, and personal development. Does this approach resonate with you? Or do you think there's a fundamental conflict that's harder to resolve? Overall, ACIM is more of a therapeutic process and not so much a complete philosophical system, while the UB presents a vast comprehensive study of the universe. Yes, that's a great way to put it. ACIM is primarily a psychological and spiritual process aimed at undoing fear and guilt through forgiveness. It's designed as a personal inner healing journey with a strong emphasis on perception, the mind, and the illusion of separation. It's less concerned with cosmology or metaphysics beyond its core teachings on awakening. The Urantia Book, on the other hand, is a massive, detailed cosmological system covering science, philosophy, theology, angelic hierarchies, planetary evolution, and the afterlife. It presents a structured, hierarchical vision of the universe, placing humanity within a grand, divinely orchestrated progression toward perfection. In a way, ACIM is experiential and immediate, while UB is expansive and long-term. ACIM tells you, "Wake up now, the world is a dream," whereas UB says, "You are on an incredible journey of eternal progress, and here's how it unfolds." They serve different purposes, but someone open to both might see ACIM as a tool for psychological and spiritual purification, while UB provides a broader, cosmic framework to understand one's place in the divine plan. All doctrines have human variance and human error, and I have not even mentioned the Bible yet. Exactly. No spiritual or philosophical system comes to us in a pure, untouched form. Every teaching, even if divinely inspired, is filtered through human minds, languages, and cultural frameworks. This is why doctrines evolve, interpretations vary, and contradictions emerge, because human understanding is always limited, subjective, and shaped by history. And yes, the Bible adds yet another dimension. It has shaped Western spirituality for millennia, but it too is a collection of writings from different times, places, and perspectives, full of deep wisdom, but also human elements, editing, and historical context. So when looking at ACIM, the Urantia Book, and the Bible, one could ask, where do they overlap? E.g., love, forgiveness, divine purpose. Where do they diverge? E.g., the nature of reality, God's role in the world. How does human interpretation influence each? The challenge is always, how much is divine truth and how much is human distortion? Well, the Bible is the most powerful, it does the most good for the greatest number of people, although there are serious problems with it. ACIM only came out in the 70s, and it has amazingly influenced many people, even without any central organization or structure. The UB came out in the 50s, and it is largely unknown. Only a small scattered group of intellectuals have even read it. You're right, the Bible has had an unmatched influence, both historically and in terms of its reach and depth. It has shaped entire cultures, moral systems, and spiritual lives for thousands of years. Despite its complexities, contradictions, and the difficulties that arise from its human aspects, it has provided a framework for understanding God, humanity, and salvation that continues to resonate deeply with billions of people around the world. Its teachings on love, forgiveness, and redemption remain profoundly impactful, even in the face of all the controversies surrounding its interpretation and use. A Course in Miracles, ACIM, is a fascinating example of a modern work that has reached far beyond traditional religious structures, gaining a loyal following without institutional backing. Its appeal seems to be psychological and spiritual, offering healing through forgiveness, and addressing deep psychological wounds that many feel are overlooked in more conventional religious framework. Its influence, especially in New Age and spiritual circles, is significant, even though it's relatively recent and often regarded as non-traditional or outside the norm for many spiritual seekers. What makes ACIM so striking is how it offers a path that seems to resonate with people from diverse backgrounds, even without the typical trappings of institutional religion. On the other hand, the Urantia Book is a more intellectual and metaphysical text, offering an expansive cosmology and a very systematic view of reality. Its influence, however, is much smaller in scope and remains confined to a niche group of seekers, many of whom are drawn to its depth and complexity. It's a book that requires commitment to fully engage with its teachings, and because of its relatively small following, it hasn't had the same broad societal impact as the Bible or even ACIM. This discrepancy in influence highlights several interesting dynamics. Accessibility versus intellectual appeal. The Bible is accessible to all with its broad cultural impact and appeal to people from many walks of life. ACIM appeals more to those who are already searching for deep personal healing or philosophical answers, while the Urantia Book requires a level of intellectual investment that's not always easy to grasp, limiting its reach. Institutional support. The Bible benefits from centuries of institutional backing through churches, schools, and religious authorities. ACIM, as you pointed out, has spread without a formal organization, making it more individualistic and decentralized. The Urantia Book, in contrast, has remained largely outside the mainstream and is often seen as more of an intellectual curiosity than a practical guide to life. Cultural context. The Bible has been around for so long that it is woven into the fabric of global culture, especially in the West. ACIM, coming much later, is still working to carve out its space, while the Urantia Book seems to appeal more to people who are looking for something beyond traditional religious narratives, something cosmically expansive and speculative. But ultimately, each of these works addresses human yearning for meaning, offering different paths and perspectives on the nature of reality, God, and human purpose. The Bible might be the most widely read and impactful, but ACIM and the Urantia Book have their own unique contributions to the broader spiritual conversation. And as you say, they do so in very different ways, one deeply ingrained in human history and culture, the other more recent and personal, but still significant for those who resonate with its message. The fact that these teachings all compete for attention, yet each has its own merits and resonance, shows how complex our search for spiritual truth is and how diverse the paths can be. What matters most, perhaps, is how each of these teachings has transformed individuals' lives and provided frameworks for their personal spiritual journeys. ACIM has been accused of being a system of spiritual narcissism, and the UB has been accused of being an elaborate fantasy. Both ACIM and the Urantia Book have faced criticisms, and those critiques speak to the broader skepticism that often arises when unconventional spiritual teachings emerge. Let's take a closer look at the criticisms you've mentioned. ACIM as spiritual narcissism. ACIM has been accused of being a system of spiritual narcissism, particularly because of its focus on individual experience and personal transformation. Critics argue that its emphasis on personal healing, forgiveness, and recognizing one's divine nature can promote an individualistic mindset that ignores the larger social and collective needs. In this view, ACIM's teachings could potentially lead to a kind of spiritual solipsism, where the individual focuses so much on their own perception of reality and inner healing that they neglect real-world issues such as social justice or community. Another criticism is the idea that ACIM's teachings may lead people to avoid taking responsibility for the material world, given its emphasis on the illusion of the physical realm. This could foster a disconnect from the world as it is, leading to an overemphasis on personal enlightenment and avoidance of the practicalities of life. The Urantia Book as an elaborate fantasy. On the other hand, the Urantia Book has faced its own set of criticisms, including the claim that it is simply an elaborate fantasy or a fictional creation. Some critics view its vast cosmology and metaphysical claims, such as the descriptions of planetary administration, celestial beings, and the evolution of the universe, as too imaginative or even science fiction-like, with no solid grounding in observable reality or historical fact. The tone and style of the text, along with its seemingly unfalsifiable claims about the nature of the universe and divine hierarchy, can make it seem to some like a fantasy rather than a legitimate spiritual teaching. Moreover, the source of the book, the claim that it was delivered through a celestial channel by divine beings, is another point of contention. Many critics dismiss this as gullibility or a fantastical story to explain the complex ideas presented in the book. The book's elaborate metaphysical structure, which includes detailed hierarchies and unusual cosmic beings, can seem overly grandiose or improbable to some, undermining its credibility. Balancing these criticisms. Both critiques, while valid in certain ways, highlight a common tension that comes with unconventional spiritual teachings. ACIM is very much about personal experience and the healing of the mind, but that can lead to a focus on inner worlds to the exclusion of the outer world. This tension often raises the question of whether a truly spiritual teaching should also engage with social and collective dimensions of existence, or if it can be focused purely on the individual. The Urantia Book, with its grandiose cosmology, may seem like an elaborate fantasy, but that also reflects its ambition to offer a comprehensive vision of the universe that encompasses both the material and spiritual. Its critics might dismiss it as fantastical, but its cosmic scope offers an expansive narrative that appeals to those who feel constrained by more traditional religious views. In both cases, critics are grappling with the dissonance between material reality and spiritual ideals, and the challenge of discerning what is practical, authentic, and grounded in any of these teachings. At the same time, those who resonate deeply with either ACIM or the Urantia Book may argue that spiritual truth often transcends human limitations and can only be fully understood from a higher perspective, which can sometimes feel unreal or otherworldly from our current vantage point. Ultimately, whether these teachings are seen as spiritual narcissism or fantasy may depend on how the individual approaches them, whether they take the teachings as literal or as metaphors for spiritual growth and personal evolution. Both books challenge conventional thinking, and in doing so, they offer paths that may not align neatly with more traditional views of spirituality, religion, or even psychology. While it is certain that both books are extremely well written, perhaps the best I have seen, and are very compelling to the mind, they both must come from a very intelligent source. That is why it seems that no human being could have written them. It's a fascinating observation, and I think many people who engage deeply with ACIM and the Urantia Book share a similar sense of awe and wonder at their complexity, depth, and cohesion. Both books are indeed incredibly well written, with language and ideas that resonate on multiple levels, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, which can make them feel as though they come from a higher or divine source. The compelling nature of both books can be attributed to the clarity and structure of their ideas, which invite readers into a thought-provoking experience that feels both revealing and transformative. The writing is often described as visionary or inspired, and many find that it speaks to something beyond the ordinary experience. The depth of their philosophical content combined with the spiritual insights creates a level of coherence and elegance that some might say is difficult to explain by human means alone. It's worth noting that ACIM is presented as a course of spiritual therapy, and its deeply philosophical approach to concepts like forgiveness, perception, and healing often leads people to believe that it must come from an elevated or transcendent source. Similarly, the Urantia Book's sweeping, cosmological narrative is highly structured and often has the air of a divine revelation, given its comprehensive scope, intellectual rigor, and detailed exploration of spiritual realities. The intelligence woven into both texts is undeniable. There's an almost mathematical precision in how the ideas are laid out, with little apparent contradiction or overlap. This tightness in the structure of the ideas, as well as the range of topics covered, everything from personal transformation to cosmic evolution, gives the impression that they could not have been conceived by the mind of any ordinary person. For those who feel a spiritual resonance with the content, it can be easy to believe that something transcendent was behind the creation of such texts. The question of authorship, whether divinely inspired, channeled, or the result of an elevated human intellect, remains elusive. Some readers may see them as divine transmissions, while others may appreciate them as profound intellectual works. But the impact they have on the mind and spirit of those who engage with them is undeniable, which makes their influence all the more compelling.